It's French February, so I think that gives me a great excuse to get something that's been sitting in the stash, out of the stash, built and potentially completed. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minute, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Dewoitine D.520 C1 in 1/72 scale from Mistercraft. So let's get this one down onto the workbench. So this is a model kit that I've had in my stash for a number of years. I remember that I bought it quite cheaply and I thought it would make a fun little build. Unfortunately though, having had a quick look through the box, it has put me off a little bit, but I think with French February it's probably time to just get this one built and put on display. This build is going to present some challenges in more ways than one, but let's explore that as we get into it. As usual, I'm going to put a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. As usual, I'm going to cut the parts away from the sprue using my side cutters and clean up any flash or excess plastic using my knife or a sanding stick. As no doubt this is probably not a surprise to most of us, this is an older tooling and it does suffer from quite a bit of flash in a few places. I try my best to remove all these extra bits that are not really meant to be there, but it is frustrating the level of flash that is present. I've decided that during this build my cement of choice will be Tamiya Extra Thin, and the first step was to glue the pilot's seat into position on the lower half of the wing. As for cockpit details, that's pretty much all you get in this kit. So the next step was to glue the upper wing halves onto the lower wing halves. At this point I thought it was time to paint the internal cockpit areas. Tamiya XF19, which is a sky grey colour, was thinned down with some Tamiya X20A acrylic thinner. It was a simple process to just paint this on the internal areas, including the chair and the internal cockpit walls inside of the fuselage. Humbrol Clear Fix is a clear glue which I will use to install the clear parts. In the design of this particular aircraft there are some little windows towards the rear of the cockpit. These were glued into position here from the inside. You'll be able to notice that I have already masked them with some masking tape on the outside surfaces. With that done, I installed the mounting point for the propeller on the nose. I could then join the other half of the fuselage. I'm going to turn my attention to the pilot now, and for his overall colour I decided to use the Army Painter Speed Paint Satchel Brown. Quite like speed paints because they go into all the nooks and crannies and give a reasonable representation of contrast straight away. Next was Grim Black, and this was painted onto his boots and some other elements. Broadsword Silver was used on his flying goggles. I would try and use some pallid bone to pick out the straps on his body, but the paint is a little bit too pale and not really noticeable. I'll address that in a minute. Tamiya Flat Flesh was carefully applied to the skin areas on the pilot's face, whilst Tamiya Khaki would address those straps and make them a little bit more visible. This is the final step I'm going to make with the pilot figure. He's not the best moulded in the world, but I think he will do. I'll leave the pilot figure off the aircraft for a little while and instead join the fuselage onto the wings at this point. There are some gaps, so some Ammo MiG Putty Surfacer Medium was applied to the various areas which needed a little bit more filling. When it was dry I would spend quite a bit of time working to sand down these seams and make them a little bit more presentable. However, in the finished builds there are still a few that are visible, but I didn't want to spend like the rest of the year just polishing this kit, so I got to a point that I was happy and then moved on. Now I can glue the pilot figure into place. I've decided to install him in the aircraft to hide the fact there's no cockpit details. I did have to remove some material off of the bottom of the pilot because he sits a little high and the canopy doesn't quite fit otherwise. The tail surfaces were then glued into their slots on the rear of the aircraft, and the engine exhausts glued onto the side of the nose. The tail wheel and the aerial mast were glued onto the bottom of the aircraft, and then the landing gear legs were glued onto the landing gear doors. These landing gear legs were then glued into their holes in the bottom of the aircraft. You'll notice there's no landing gear bay details, and it is basically open straight up into the cockpit, which will cause a slight problem later on. Another aerial mast is glued into position at the top of the aircraft, and then I began assembling the propeller. The spinner is glued onto the propeller, and I'll add it to the model a bit later. I have masked up the clear canopy part using my normal method to apply tape, and then cut it to the right size following the canopy lines. I used some Humbrol Clear Fix, which is a stringy clear glue, to attach it to the model. Hopefully this glue will dry clear and strong without reacting to the plastic. And now it is time to prime. It's on my t-shirt. So here I'm using Humbrol No. 1 acrylic grey. This is a product I use quite frequently as I love how easy it is to work with. It sticks to the plastic really well and acts as a key for the next layers of paints. A couple of thin coats of this paint would be needed. Thanks to the support of my Model Club members on the screen now, I've actually gone and purchased a specific paint set for French aircraft. Inside of this Vallejo Model Air set is everything that I may require to paint this particular aircraft. So thanks to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel and fueling my plastic addiction. The first paint that I needed was a medium grey. This will be the lower side colour of the camouflage scheme. So this was loaded into my airbrush and applied to the lower sides of the aircraft. And when that was done, what I've got here is a print scale camouflage mask set and decals. I've decided that for this build I'm not going to use the Mistercraft decals. I've struggled with them in previous builds and I want to try an aftermarket set to see if they're any different. This set comes with a camouflage paint mask, which is fantastic as it will make this step so much easier. This camouflage mask set is pre-cut vinyl. All I need to do is peel it off and stick it on as per the painting instructions. This was a relatively simple step to complete, everything being more or less accurately labelled and pretty much to the right size. I'm not entirely sure that this kind of kit or this brand of kit is the one that this was designed to be used for, and I would at times have to use a little bit of extra tape just to cover up some gaps, but on the whole it worked pretty well. So with the lower sides masked, the next step was to spray on the next colour. So I'm working from lightest to darkest, so the next one up is a grey. And this was airbrushed onto the upper surfaces of the aircraft. I would leave that to dry, and after a little while I would apply the relevant vinyl masks for the paint scheme, and then this NATO green was loaded into my airbrush as well. Following the painting instructions, I'm going to spray this onto the sections of the aircraft that require the green element of the camouflage scheme. And that colour is going to be burnt umber. So I only need this for a little bit. There's only a few little patches which need this colour, and again, after this was loaded into the airbrush, I would spray this onto the relevant areas. Again, taking care to avoid getting it on the green patches that I've already done, as I've not bothered to mask them. And when that was done and had been left to dry, I carefully peeled off all the masks and they've done a really good job. There's not much in the way of any paint bleed on the model, none that I could really notice anyway. I do quite like using these vinyl paint masks as they make things so much easier. So, as mentioned, I've got the print scale decals. I'm not a massive fan of the Mistercraft ones, I've struggled with them in the past and I wanted to try something different. So the print scale decal set and the camouflage vinyl masks that I've just used cost about the same as the actual kit that I bought for this video. So I'm hoping they're going to be pretty good. I cut the sheet into more manageable sections and then dipped them into warm water to release them from the backing paper. As is quite normal, I'm going to be using Micro Set and Micro Sol as my setting solutions during this build. First up, the microset from the blue bottle was brushed onto the relevant areas of the model where the transfers were going to be applied. I then carefully slid the transfers off the backing paper and positioned them. So far everything seems to be going okay. But now it's time to apply the larger ones on the tail of the aircraft. And this is when things start to become a bit more apparent that these decals are not as, well, good as I thought they were going to be. So whilst putting these decals onto the model and using a bit more micro set, I've started to notice that these decals are flaky and starting to split. In actual fact, they're behaving in the exact same way that Mistercraft decals I've used previously also behave. I don't think I've actually spent my money wisely here and got a better set. They seem to be almost exactly the same in quality. To try and save the remaining decals I've got to apply, I used some micro scale liquid decal film on them. This was painted onto the transfers still remaining to be added to the model, and my hope here is that this will act as an extra layer and prevent these ones from cracking and splitting. After that had been dried, I repeated my application process. So whilst I have applied this liquid decal film, and they're not splitting as much as they had done previously, I'm still finding that these decals are not particularly great. They're really struggling to settle down into the surface details, even with further applications of microsol from the red bottle. It is really surprising how these are behaving just like Mistercraft transfers. I think it's also worth mentioning as I apply these decals that the print scale instructions don't tell you where to put everything. They seem to be missing some images, which would have given a bit of extra clarity. I ended up having to look online to find out where all the decals should go. But anyways, with that done and the decals now applied, some Humbrol clear matte varnish was loaded into my airbrush. I didn't thin this down, it's simply straight out of the bottle, and what this is hopefully going to do is protect the transfers from any rough handling or subsequent work that I'm about to do, whilst also giving the aircraft a uniform finish. This matte varnish isn't completely as matte as other products I've used, but seeing as I've not applied any gloss or anything onto this aircraft, the finish should be acceptable. Whilst that's drying, I'm going to move on to this Vallejo black. This was painted onto the propeller assembly and also onto the wheels. Some Humbrol Matte 99, which is a lemon colour, was used to pick out the warning flashes at the tips of the propeller blades. This silver colour was then carefully applied to the hubs of the wheels. I took my time here to make sure I didn't get it on the tyres. I'd also not forget the legs for the landing gear, which are currently attached to the aircraft. I mixed up some gunmetal and burnt umber paint to create a kind of burnt metal kind of colour. This was then very carefully added onto the engine exhausts. Now that things are dry, I'm going to glue the wheels onto the landing gear legs, and you'll notice that the mounting pins are very long and protrude quite a long way through them. The propeller was then attached to the nose, and I then carefully removed the canopy masking, which seems to have done a pretty good job. And that's it. That's as far as I'm going with this build of the Mistercraft D520. But before I get too far into this build, you're probably asking yourself, what is French February? Well, I think the best person to explain this is Miss Modeler. Over to you.
French February. It's something I started a few years ago now and has evolved ever since. It started because I've always loved French aviation, probably because in, I guess, popular culture in Britain, we don't really talk too much about the Battle of France and the French aviators that led the way for European aviation, or at least challenged some of the leaders of European aviation anyway. And I've always loved them. I think the first one I ever saw probably was the Dewoitine D.520 when I was a kid, and I built the frog kit, and I built it in Italian markings. But now, as an adult, I decided to spend 1 month a year dedicated to the unusual French subjects that we find ourselves with. I also do this in my Discord, so you can find the link for that in the description below. You can build anything, as long as it was either made in France or served in France, whether it's a car, plane, ship, boat, tank, or I guess dioramas, infantry, whatever, as long as it's French in some way. That's the only rules. Just have fun. Anyone of any skill level is welcome. Right, I guess let's get back to your expected video, and hopefully you can go and subscribe to my channel too and see all the other people doing French February this year.
So, what do I think of this kit? Well, there's a few things to discuss in this, isn't there? So, Mistercraft on the box, they say it's new, but it's probably new to them. If I remember correctly, this is a kit which I purchased a couple of years ago, but I'm led to believe that the production date is around 2016, so nearly a decade ago now. So it was new to Mistercraft back then, but it isn't a new kit, as we can probably tell. This is actually a Hella tooling, which dates from 1965. For a 1965 kind of kit, it's not terrible. It does fit together, but there are gaps. The parts don't necessarily align correctly and have seams, and also, as we saw, some of the details are very crude. One area that has annoyed me slightly is the fact that there's nothing in the landing gear bays, and when I was painting this earlier, I didn't really think about that and didn't sort of stuff anything inside those landing gear bays. So now if you look carefully, you might be able to see little speckles of paint on the inside of the cockpit canopy, because if the landing gear bays are completely open, that paint has just sort of blown its way inside of the cockpit, which is very frustrating. I could probably remove the cockpit canopy carefully and clean the inside and then reattach it, but I thought that might end up damaging the kit more than it would sort of fix a problem. So yeah, I wish there was detail in the landing gear bays. Staying with the landing gear bays, I didn't address the fact that those sort of pins for the wheels massively project through there. I just left them as they are because I thought they were quite funny. I think one of the most annoying things about this build though is the fact that I spent almost the same amount on the kit, and I think at the time when I bought this it was like £8 for the kit, and I spent a similar amount of money on those print scale decals and masks. The masks, fantastic. I like the masks. I only had to do a little bit of tape work in a few places to cover up a few little gaps where it didn't quite fit, but the masks are really good. The painting instructions for the print scale decals, they leave a little bit to be desired. They aren't as thorough. They don't tell you where everything goes, and I had to Google that myself. But the decals are basically the same. I mean, these are the kit decals here, and these look exactly the same as I've used on other Mistercraft kits. And there's another set here actually. I've put them to one side, and I think to myself, like, if these were basically the same quality, why didn't I just not spend the extra money and just use these instead? That being said, the Mistercraft instructions are a little bit poor as well. So if you've seen my unboxing, you'll know that there are decals which are mentioned on here but not necessarily included in the kit. So that's part of the reason why I went for an aftermarket set, and also because I thought they'd be better, but then they just weren't. So kind of could have just stuck with these and probably would have had the same results. So the Mistercraft boxing, you actually get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Technically you get 6 decal schemes, which is pretty good, but then, you know, they're not the best quality. But then I spent my extra money and I got 1 decal scheme, and again it was basically the same quality. Masks though, I could probably reuse them on something else, because I managed to peel them off and put back on the sheet. Masks were probably the best part about this set here. I have bought more print scale decals, which I was going to use on another project, but I've not used them yet, so hopefully those ones are a little bit better quality, but I will be cautious with them in the future. But yeah, this kit was retailing. Supposedly its recommended retail price for €12.99, which just seems excessive to me. If you can get this cheaper and you want to build it as a sort of cheap mojo build and practice skills and things, then absolutely fantastic. That's probably the best way to go with this. But for a serious model of the D520, I'm not so sure it's the right one. I know that there are other brands out there with more recent tooling, so if I wanted a proper kit, I'd probably be looking at those. So I'm just making sure I've not missed anything, and I'm looking through my book. I keep all my notes. I've actually started my second one because I filled up the last one. If you want to get a copy of this to put on your own workbench and keep a log of your own builds, you'll find a link in the description, and it helps out the channel as well. So I have written in here, this took me 2 days to do. I didn't do a great deal. I could have added pre-shading, but I didn't see the point because there were so many different layers of camouflage being built up. I could have added a wash, but I didn't see the point because the details that are present on the kit are so shallow that they wouldn't really catch it. I could have added weathering and things, but again, I didn't really see the point because by the time I'd got to applying the matte varnish over the top and finishing off the build of this kit, I was like, I'm done. I'm pretty much done. You know, when sometimes you start building something and you're excited for it and then you lose your motivation. Maybe I'll come back and revisit it in the future, but for now I'm pretty much going to call this one done. One of the notes that I have written here is maybe I should stop buying cheap kits. Maybe next one I build will be a little bit better quality. But yeah, I think that's probably it. I'm going to wrap this one up here. This is an old kit which suffers given its age and the fact that in my particular example, the decal scheme that I decided to go for also wasn't of the highest of quality. Perhaps perfect as a mojo build to try out some new skills and techniques, but I think that if you wanted a serious model, you might be looking at a different tooling. And with that, let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and my review of this model kit. As always, I'm open to other suggestions for other kits you'd like to see me build on the channel. Once again, honourable mention to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel and for supporting my plastic addiction. If you'd like to join these people on screen or support the channel in other ways, take a look at the links in the description to find out how. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. Mistercraft D.520, I think. Yeah, I think that should have worked, that one. Take one. Hopefully the only take. Oh my word, I forgot where I'm going with this. These transfers were still not particularly great. They were really struggling to settle down into the... Oh, doorbell. Doorbell. Alright, where did I get to? Where am I up to? Take 2, isn't it? Take 2. D520, take 2. Get out. Right.